they recognize new antibiotics aren't being discovered or commercialized at the same rate as resistance is increasing. So you go through the process, and this is billions of dollars in 10 years from, point of discovery to actual commercialization. And then once you have the FDA approvals, now your drug is kind of shelved within the hospital because they're using it as a last resort.
Public health. It's on everyone's mind these days, from hand washing to emerging pathogens. Welcome to Transmission Control, an infection prevention podcast focused on your appetite for trailblazing thought, discussion, and innovations that will help you make informed decisions. Each episode, we speak with public health experts and safety champions from across the globe as they share their experiences, passion, and opinions. From investigative journalism to medical publications, we tackle real-world barriers to halting the spread of disease. Whether you are tuning in for education, inspiration, or to hear the stories that need to be told, thank you for joining us. And now, get ready to blast off with your weekly injection of insight on transmission control.
This week on Transmission Control, we speak with Carmela Mascio, president and co-founder at LivOnyx. And Larry, we're going to be talking about hand hygiene today, but we're going to put it into context because there are so many things right now that are presenting challenges to infection control. And this is just one of those topics. And I know when we talk to Carmela, I won't be able to resist talking about my experience as a registered nurse. But if you even just think about all the steps that are involved in hand washing, if you've been trained as a registered nurse like I have, it's very complex, and that leaves a lot of room for human error. And we're going to be discussing all of that on this episode today.
And how to reduce some of that human error by the use maybe of some automated systems, which I hadn't really thought about or have very little, if any, knowledge about, taking this manual process of manual cleaning and standardizing it in order to enhance compliance, certainly, to deliver better performance, reliability, and effectiveness. And I think all of this is really a grassroots approach to start addressing, or one of the corrective actions to address this issue of antibiotic resistance, that if our hands aren't transmitting the organisms and patients aren't getting infected with these resistant bugs, well, we don't need the antibiotics as much, and therefore antibiotic resistant, the runway that we talk about, can be effectively lengthened. I'm also interested in hearing a little bit about the FDA versus the EPA oversight of hand sanitizers versus automated devices that might sanitize hands, as opposed to all of these issues. Where did the EPA and FDA come in all of this? And even we'll get some discussion about what proper hand hygiene even is. That's something that everyone says, well, practice proper hand hygiene. Well, I don't know what that means, really. I mean, in one sense, I know what it means, but when you tell me to stand over a sink and do it, I kind of not sure I would know what to do or how to do it. So I'm really excited about learning about that, because that's something that, you should know the first day you enter this world. Day one, you should know how to properly clean your hands. So
all I know is if I go into a bathroom at the airport and stand there for 10 minutes and watch people, I guarantee you that there are very few that are doing proper hand hygiene, at least the way I was trained to do it.
And particularly, we know from hospitals, it's understandable why hand hygiene compliance is so challenging, is because the irritation of the skin, of the tissues by using these chemicals, and the amount of time that it takes, that if, particularly in COVID-19 days, if staff need to be attending to patients, they can't be in the bathroom washing their hands. So there's this tension that what we should be doing, hand washing, is more problematic than really meets the eye.
All right, everybody. This is going to be a great episode. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back with Carmela Mascio, president and co-founder at LivOnyx. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Dr. Lawrence Muscarella.
From 17 Studios, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Joining us now is Carmela Mascio, president and co-founder at LivOnyx, and we're going to be talking about hand hygiene. And I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, Carmela, when I went to nursing school, I think we got the hand hygiene course at the beginning of every semester straight through. And yet I'm still not sure everybody knows how to do it right, despite being such a point of emphasis. So very excited to have you on the show. And, we kind of found you when we were perusing through LinkedIn. So I want to commend you for getting educational content out there as well. And thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. And one of the things I am strangely passionate about is hand hygiene, particularly because it truly is your first line of defense to preventing infections. And so I am thrilled to be able to talk about it. And you're right, it's something that we do, starting out as toddlers, right? It's some of the fundamental things we learn of cleaning our hands, yet even though it's something we do every day, we're often not doing it right and stuff. And so we can talk about ways when it's really, really important to get it right, and other times when it's okay to not do it as strictly.
So, Carmela, you and I had a chance to speak before we had you come on the show, and I really found your story of, president and co-founder, but founding LivOnyx really interesting. And so, it's almost like you didn't intend to become an entrepreneur, but then you did. So I think there's lots of people out there that might have always thought, oh, it'd be so cool to own my own company, but that's just not me. I could never do that. And I think it would just be really cool to hear your path to how you started this company.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so it's funny. I work out of an incubator space, and there's so many entrepreneurs there that have what I've thought of as the kind of classical entrepreneur phenotype, where they get excited about starting a company and selling it off and then starting another one and selling it off. I'm more of your reluctant leader, where I had an amazing career for 12 years at a company called Cubist Pharmaceuticals. For those that aren't aware of what Cubist did, we were highly focused on antibiotic discovery in acute care settings. So this means that we were developing antibiotics with IV use. So this is when you're so sick that you're in the hospital. So I had this just amazing career in drug discovery in the infectious disease departments there, and getting to have a hand in antibiotic development. But during my tenure there, the CDC had put out a report about 1 out of every 25 patients that go into the hospital come out with an infection they didn't have to start with. So of course that begged the question for us of where are these infections coming from? So as we started to dig into it a bit more, we found those are coming from either hands from surfaces that are contaminated in the hospitals or durable medical equipment. And so we decided as a company, despite the fact that we're inventing and discovering antibiotics, these infections are so much of a concern, we need to stop them from even starting. So we started this stealth infection prevention project. And so I had a couple of years working on this amazing, really blank space. We didn't know what we were building. We were drug discoverers, not engineers, not builders. So I got to co-lead this effort. And then as Cubist became wildly successful, we also became attractive for acquisition. And so in the beginning of 2015, we were acquired. At that point, the research organization was the first wave of people to be let go, which was completely heartbreaking for me. And I found myself continuing to think about the patients and the healthcare practitioners that we had set out to help. We were trying to develop a device that was going to be used for hand sanitization, for room disinfection. And we had heard numerous accounts of they're desperate for something new because they've essentially been using a 40-year-old technology to clean hands with, and it wasn't enough. And their hands are completely damaged and shredded, and they don't have enough time during the day to even use the bathroom, never mind clean their hands half their shift. And so I felt like this, almost like a moral obligation to finish what I started. And so I ended up talking to the former CEO of Cubist, and I said, listen, I'm a microbiologist. I have zero business starting a business. I kill things for a living, but I can't stop thinking about the project that we are working on. So do you think that I have a chance at making it as a go of a company, as a startup? Because it made sense for Cubist to do this. We were very well respected in the medical community. We had a presence in the healthcare systems, but as a standalone company, does this still make sense? And he agreed. And so he was thrilled that we were picking up the gauntlet. And so we assembled the team around us, and he became our major investor at that point and started LivOnyx. So I really do feel like I fell into it, and I had to do a lot of learning on the job. But here I am, running the company and trying to make a difference for healthcare workers and patients and beyond.
That's awesome. And, you're talking about your experience in drug discovery, and I'm going to take it right to antibiotic discovery, because a common theme for Larry and I, not only on the show, but just in our general discussions, is the fact that we feel like there's a runway for antibiotics due to resistance that's just getting shorter and shorter. And my understanding, and you can clarify this if I'm incorrect, but my understanding is that the ROI on developing new antibiotics is just not there. And so we're not seeing new ones. And even when we do, their lifespan is so short. That's why there's no ROI. So I think technologies that prevent, and it's part of the reason we call this show transmission control, that prevent transmissions at the start, that means less infections, later on down the line. But is that true about the direction of the industry? Are we careening towards, we're like in a train careening towards a brick wall where at some point there's just antibiotics, if we don't find a different way to use them and prescribe them, that we're just not going to have any more runway for their effectiveness?
Yeah, it is true. And it's such an unfortunate reality. So I would say about 25 years ago, you had kind of a mass exodus out of the antibiotic discovery. And so some of it was, there's this golden era of antibiotic discovery where there was all this low hanging fruit of natural products, so shortly after penicillin. And so there was a lot coming out onto the market. But as the years progressed, drug discovery is incredibly expensive, right? It's billions and billions of dollars from the point of research to the point where you're actually commercial. The incentive for hospitals to use antibiotics is stymied by they recognize new antibiotics aren't being discovered or commercialized at the same rate as resistance is increasing. So you go through the process, and this is billions of dollars in 10 years from, point of discovery to actual commercialization. And then once you have the FDA approvals, now your drug is kind of shelved within the hospital because they're using it as a last resort, right? They're going to go through all of the other older antibiotics and they're going to hit it with that major punch coming down the line, which makes it really hard to make it attractive for, investors to then invest in antibiotic discovery for that reason, because that return on investment is, going to be diminished by comparison. There are some mechanisms that have been explored. So like there's the GAIN Act, and so generating antibiotic incentives now. And so that's where working with the FDA, you can have like a longer extension on your exclusivity for regulatory. So it used to be 10 years. And so extending that out. So trying to give incentives for companies to return to it. In the pharmaceutical world, you look at, by definition, an antibiotic is supposed to be a short course. So it's maybe 7 days, 10 days, 14 days. So you can understand in favor of chronic use medicine. So things like blood pressure medication, diabetes medication. So pharma really then did go towards those things where chronic care meant a lot more revenue, right? Because if you're giving somebody something for the next 20 years of their life compared to only 10 or 15 days, it's a huge difference. And so I think there's a lot that can be done at many levels to incentivize companies to come back to it. Because you're right, we're careening towards that cliff edge and we're gonna run out of options, and it's dangerous.
So Carmela, and thank you for clarifying that for us and the listeners. And I had two thoughts, kind of questions and comments. First one is, I guess this is the tension that you're talking about, that the infectious disease physicians want to use the antibiotic to treat the patient, but by using the antibiotic, the paradox or the irony is that you basically start, and the clock is ticking, where it will become ineffective. So its use undermines its own ability to kill because of antibiotic resistance. Is that fair?
Right, yeah.
And the second point is there is a model that I don't hear talked about too much. We're talking about return on investment. Is this an opportunity? Has the government stepped in where there's other models? For example, if you own a house near the coastline and you can't get private insurance for hurricane damage, you might have the government with a FEMA or state step in and then quote unquote underwrite the insurance. Is that something that's viable so that we don't have to just worry about private investment moving antibiotics forward? I mean, can the government get involved and help solve this problem and lengthen this runway we're talking about?
That's a great question. I don't know if they're going to get involved in terms of the financial aspect and funding companies, though certainly there are funding mechanisms through the National Institutes of Health and all of their 17 institutes that you have a lot of early stage companies even doing therapeutics that are able to get non-dilutive funding. And I imagine also within the Department of Defense and, the military and stuff, there's a lot of incentives to have very powerful anti-infectives and antimicrobials for soldiers and that kind of thing. So I think there is that avenue. One of the other incentives that is in play right now is this idea of a qualified infectious disease pathogen. And so essentially what it is that the regulatory agencies incentivizing pharmaceuticals to do the science and do the research to try to commercialize. And what they're doing is they're making the regulatory pathway easier in terms of preferred status when you submit your application. And so you would have the fast track status. So instead of having to wait in queue for 90 days before you get an initial review, you could have a rolling submission of your data instead of having to wait till the entire phase 1, 2, and 3 package is ready. So they do have some incentives on that front as well. But I definitely think there needs to be more. Antimicrobial resistance has always been a problem. And actually now there's reports because of the pandemic, you're seeing a huge uptick in antimicrobial resistance from the bacteria side. So we've been also focused on, SARS-CoV-2 as a virus. And because hospitals have had to make concessions in PPE that they're using across rooms and having to use like the same gowns because supplies are limited and stuff, you're seeing now a huge uptick in other kinds of infections. So you're having a higher uptick in your MRSA infections and that kind of thing. And so I think there's just a lot that needs to be addressed in general. And I think the pandemic has highlighted that there's some significant gaps that we need to look at.
So I want to jump right in and get into the primary objective of our discussion today, and it's hand hygiene and how to improve compliance, for example, because better hand hygiene is going to reduce transmission of these antibiotic-resistant pathogens and therefore contribute to solving the problem. But before we do that, and you explain, please, for the listener and myself, what exactly proper hand hygiene is. What does it mean to properly wash your hands? But just before we get to that, you caught my attention that I'd like to tie a loose end on, where you said that there's been an uptick in the antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections in hospitals. Maybe you can explain a quirk that I've observed. I agree with that, but when I'm reading the literature, I'm not seeing that. So I think we all can agree that when we were giving antibiotics to people with COVID-19, we're going to be developing resistance. And let me be specific. When I go to the medical device database, the MAUDE, M-A-U-D-E, FDA database, and I look for medical instrumentation, which you said earlier was durable medical instrumentation, I think you said was one way in which these bugs are being transferred. If I look at the MAUDE reports linked describing, for example, complex reusable medical devices like flexible endoscopes, I'm not seeing a real significant increase in what I would call superbug outbreaks linked to these devices. Now, that doesn't mean it's not happening. It's just I'm not seeing it reported in the database. Do you have a comment on that? And then can we jump into what it actually means to clean your hands properly?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the durable medical equipment, you're right. So I'm not surprised that you're not seeing that information on things like endoscopes or colonoscopes. And my feeling behind that, and this is just conjecture, is that over the course of the pandemic, those kind of surgeries or procedures that we would consider more elective, people were just simply not going into the hospital. So you were not having the same level of use of endoscopes and colonoscopes where you would see some of those like the Enterobacteriaceae infections and that kind of thing. The uptick that I'm talking about are ventilator associated pneumonias, CLABSI, so your catheter line associated bloodstream infections. So these are things that are consequences of being in the hospital because of COVID. And so you have catheters in, so you're seeing a lot of uptick in UTIs as well. And so it's those kind of things where some things where you may have, even C. diff has kind of gone up a little bit too because of the lack of hand washing. Right now we're focusing on using hand sanitizer because it's all about speed, but hand sanitizer doesn't work against Clostridium difficile spores. And so you're seeing a spread of that and stuff. And so, and So I think where I saw the report was coming out of the CDC, and that some of it is just anecdotal data right now coming out of hospitals. And I think now it's going to have to go to like peer review journaled and that kind of thing, but that they're seeing that increase in hospital acquired infection. So where we had seen a decrease since 2011, since they've been tracking it, we now see an uptick in some of the kinds of HIIs.
Oh, that's a really good clarification, and you've filled in some gaps for me. So can we talk a little bit about what it means to we're in a hospital and we want to enhance compliance? And one strategy where we might be able to enhance hand washing compliance would be engineering controls. And they're devices that maybe do sanitizing in hospitals, for example. So can you tell us what it means to actually properly clean your hands in terms of maybe seconds? Would you use soap? Would you use water? Might you use a alcohol rub, or might you use a device that quote unquote sprays the hands to sanitize them? What exactly are you thinking about how we can improve compliance and what we need to be doing to be properly complying with CDC guidelines, for example?
Sure. So I'd love to say there's just an easy answer to that. So forgive me, it's a very complex thing. And so which is kind of funny. Again, this is something that we've done since we were toddlers, but actually the act of cleaning hands is complex. So there's lots of factors that come into play. So if you're talking about using traditional soap and water, which is a gold standard in healthcare, particularly if you have things like norovirus or Clostridium difficile spores, which are not inhibited by hand sanitizer. You have your gold standard if your hands are visibly soiled. That requires the right amount of soap, and then you're, spreading palms to palms between fingers. You've got to get the tips of your fingers. You have to get the thumbs. The thumb is almost always missed. The tips of the fingers are almost always missed. So it's not just the mechanical action and the mechanical disruption of the germs, because essentially you want to create little bubbles around the germs to get them to come off the hands. It's then also important how you rinse the soap off of your hands. And so a lot of people, when they're rinsing their hands, their natural inclination is to hold their hands upright. And so you now have water flowing down your hand, which means those germs are coming down your hand and they've not gone anywhere. So you want to be pointing your fingers down to shake the excess water off before reaching for a paper towel. So it's all of that. And then it gets even more complicated when you talk about hand sanitizer, because you need to know what kind of sanitizer you're actually working with. And it's a very specific volume over a specific amount of time, put on in a specific motion in order to achieve the right kill level. And that actually changes depending on what sanitizer you're using. And so what I like to tell people is, if your hands aren't wet after you've used hand sanitizer, sanitizer can't kill what it doesn't touch. And so I'll see people, and not just in healthcare settings, but also outside of it, of like, oh, well, that's just too much volume. So we're going to do like the Spock move, and we'll put our hand underneath the dispenser and open up our fingers to only catch half of it. But that means you're not getting enough volume to actually kill the pathogens on your hands. And so it really is this kind of all of these things coming together of the right volume, the right amount of time deposited all over. So it can't kill what it can't touch. And it needs to stay wet for at least 20 seconds when you're talking about alcohol-based hand sanitizers for it to actually achieve that 99.9% efficacy.
That's my favorite, because you'll see people apply it and then they wave their hands. And, in healthcare institutions, I think a lot of people do get the training around you can't wave your hands, because if you do, it's not going to work. So
right.
why spend the money on something you're not using correctly? But I think everybody knows that this is an opportunity, but how do you quantify it? Like what is the opportunity here?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Like, I think we know that we need to do better. And so if we're using the same active ingredients that we have been using for the last 40 years, the better is just simply repeatedly educating, right? Because we become kind of tone deaf to signs and to alert noises and like that kind of thing. And so it's just the repetitive nature of, watching and giving that positive feedback when it doesn't happen the right way. And, I don't believe in being punitive about it and that kind of thing. But I really think the big thing is that we need innovation in hand hygiene products. And so right now, all of the hand hygiene products that you find on the market have the same 27 active ingredients that are found in the healthcare antiseptic monograph or the consumer monograph for hand hygiene products. And essentially what that means is as long as you are using any one of these 27 active ingredients within these concentrations, it's a quick 510K pathway for your product because these things are generally recognized as safe and effective. So really what we need is we need new active ingredients that have to go through an actual regulatory process that can kill all of the pathogens or germs that you find in hospitals today, like C. diff, like norovirus, which are currently not inhibited by alcohol-based hand sanitizer. And we need to get the speed down because the reality is 20 seconds of wet contact time actually takes a long time, like that moisture on your hands and to be able to don gloves. And that then gets in the way of being able to do the hand hygiene every time it counts. Like really, you should be cleaning your hands every time you task switch in a healthcare setting. So these 5 moments of hand hygiene, when you enter the room, before you touch the patient, before you touch equipment in the room, you've touched a surface. And so all of these things coming together, we really need it to be speed. So something closer to 3 seconds instead of 30 seconds. You need it to be non-irritating. So right now, if the audience could see my hands are completely shredded. My dad spent 5 days in the hospital and I was there cleaning my hands using their products and my hands are completely damaged. And that was just 5 days, never mind healthcare practitioners that are cleaning their hands hundreds of times a day.
Oh, I remember
shifts.
The cracks in my skin and my knuckles and I haven't done direct patient care in a while, but especially when I was practicing in Maine, the winters can get really dry. And I remember. And then I was like, well, now my number one barrier against infection is now compromised because I have all this cracked skin. So it's even more of a portal.
Right. Yeah. And it just becomes this vicious circle, right? Of healthcare practitioners know when they need to clean hands, know how important it is for preservation of self and preservation of patient. But we're not giving them tools or technology to be able to do it to the level that needs to be done to take care of the germs and pathogens today without damaging their skin. So yeah, it's just a vicious circle.
So there also seems to be this tension between something being performed manually as opposed to something being performed with an automated system. And I'm meaning specifically standardization. So in your paradigm of moving forward and issuing these corrective actions, if you will, and closing the gaps and moving us forward, how do we deal with the fact that manual washing is really a manual step? It means person A can do it differently from person B and person C. And yet, for a product to be effective, you were saying earlier, we really have to stay within the lines. We have a certain volume of the antiseptic that we need to use, or the rub, the gel, whatever it is. There's a certain temperature issue. There's a certain contact time issue. There's a certain volume. So we assure we have enough. How are we taking this? It just seems that we're taking something that we're doing manually. Don't we need to really standardize it, or else we have, results that will be all over the map, which means the results are not reliable. They're not being standardized. But how can we do that? What kind of automated systems might we use to standardize this moving forward?
Yeah, and that's exactly, you're hitting the nail on the head of we do need that fully automated solution. And by automated, not just simply walking up to a dispenser and it dispenses out your 2 mils and then you go through the motion. We mean fully automated. You insert your hands in and you're getting a full contact for the appropriate time. So some of that has to be a combination of we need antiseptics or sanitizers that can be sprayed. So for example, trying to spray alcohol in a very fine mist doesn't work very well because it's a flammable. So it evaporates too quickly. So you're not getting enough wet contact time. So you need an antiseptic that is a different formulation that's not alcohol based. And so that's an area for innovation and development. And then in terms of you need to engage with the user experience of, for example, you are going to have an instrument that can receive hands side by side with your palms facing down, because a natural inclination, if you ask people to place their palms facing down, they naturally splay their fingers wide apart, versus if you ask them to place their hands palm to palm instead of palm down, their fingers actually close. And so that's all the user experience and kind of engineering aspects that need to go into it to assure that you're automating something, but you're also taking into account people's natural behaviors and stuff. And so for some reason, when you're facing palms down, people naturally splay their fingers. It's actually a more comfortable position. And so you'll want hands to be received in that manner in order to do a full deposition. And so you have to have, the right amount of spray being sprayed for the right amount of contact time. And so again, that's where that innovation comes in of you need 3 seconds instead of 30 seconds of wet time. And you're not going to get that with alcohol.
So you alluded earlier to, or intimated at least, or as I interpreted what you were saying, and I may have been incorrect, but it seems as if these kind of automated systems that might more standardize the hand cleaning process would be under the purview of FDA oversight. And that's a little confusing for me because, when you walk into a hospital and you clean your hands, there's no federal oversight. You simply are complying with hospital policy and procedure per CDC guidance. So if we introduce some type of an automated device, it's an antiseptic. And an antiseptic, let's say for the sake of argument, would be achieving something on the order of low-level disinfection or intermediate-level disinfection, meaning the most we might be killing would be mycobacteria. So that's usually under the purview of the EPA. So can you explain for me a little bit why such a device wouldn't stay under the purview of the EPA and simply be called a pesticide, an antiseptic, a sanitizer, if you will? Why would the FDA be involved in this regulatory process, or is it not at all involved?
Yeah, no. So it definitely would be involved, particularly. So we're going to kind of parse this out into two parts. So you're going to have a regulatory pathway for the automated dispensing device, right? So anytime you have something that you're going to have to put your hands into, and there's going to be mechanics in there, there might be a moving spray arm, there may be nozzles. So that's going to fall under a medical device classification as a dispensing system, similar to how an EpiPen it's a combination product, right? You have your epinephrine on the inside, but then the actual injector is a device. So you have your device piece, and so that can be a class 2, and depending on how sophisticated it is, because there may not be a predicate, it would be a de novo class 2 device, because there wouldn't really be something to benchmark against it if you have a device that you're putting your hands into that can then also track compliance. And, so the more sophisticated, the higher the classification will be. But this isn't it's not class 3 where you're implanting a heart stent or something like that. So it's not a Band-Aid, which is a class 1, but it's not a heart stent. So it's going to be in that middle. And de novo because it's something that we haven't seen before in the healthcare setting. And then on the antiseptic side, if it's outside of that hand hygiene monograph and those active ingredients, you're looking at a new drug application. And so you'll require a full NDA approval, but not what you would think with antibiotic discovery, where you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, because you're not treating anything. These are preventative. So these are clinical simulation studies with smaller populations. These are maximal use studies to look for skin irritation, that kind of thing. So even though it's a full regulatory pathway of a new drug application, it's not the same as what you would imagine with a therapeutic focus. And so there's a different kind of essentially dollar value that goes into the R&D development of this kind of new hand sanitizer.
So you were kind of talking about, I guess we could say with the class 2 devices, we categorize them as being special controls, which would be like a 510K clearance, for example, performance testing we've talking about, and also maybe even software verification and validation.
Yes.
And that's another reason why the FDA would get involved as opposed to just the EPA overseeing this product. Okay, very good.
Yeah, particularly because this is something that, as you pointed out, if we want to remove the manual component, right, the human variability that we as human beings bring to hand hygiene, we want to then make sure the device is time after time after time after time going to deliver a consistent flow and spray pattern
outcome
or array. Exactly. And so you need to kind of do that and having that regulatory stringency behind that kind of guarantee that the delivery, it's essentially a drug delivery system. It's just for hands and a topical instead of being, a patch that's delivering an antibiotic subcutaneously or something.
Excellent.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a great interview. It went by super fast. And I'll also say that I remember when you and I talked, you were really telling me that there are so many billions of moments where hand hygiene occurs annually in acute care settings. And I thought the number, do you remember what it was? The number was like pretty big.
Yeah. So if you look at in U.S. acute care alone, there are 6,000 hospitals. And within those 6,000 hospitals, there's 3 million patient-facing healthcare workers. So if you then do the calculation for the hours worked throughout the year and that kind of thing, it translates to 50 to 70 billion moments of hand hygiene. So that's 50 to 70 billion moments to prevent an infection or transmit one.
Well, I'll tie it back to the beginning when we talked about a theme, again, that Larry and I find fascinating and is right up your alley in your experience over the last decade plus, that drug discovery and specifically around antibiotics. If we're talking about 50 to 70 billion, we now have accountable care where patients who are readmitted with an infection after a hospital stay, typically within 30 days, but 6 months if it's an implant, that is then on. Well, the hospital has to foot the bill. And so I can see where hand hygiene is just the best opportunity we have to prevent that from happening.
It's really grassroots.
Transmissions. Right. Yeah. Nip it at the root cause. Get it at the start. And I know there's plenty of other measures that can happen along the way as well. I realize it's not a singular fix, but it is definitely an important one. So nice job today, Carmela. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been so much fun. Thank you. But yeah, it's literally in everyone's hands to prevent these infections. Literally in your hands. So
that was Carmela Mascio, president and co-founder at LivOnyx. And we talked about hand hygiene, but we really talked about it in so much scale and also really the issues with a very manual process. I mean, when you look at automation industries, Larry, it's all about taking human error out of the equation. And up until now, there's really no way to take the human error out of this hand washing equation. And yet, like we said at the very end, this is the start of the process with which we use to prevent transmissions, and especially those transmissions not just occurring in the community, but it is part of our day-to-day life, but those transmissions from occurring inside of hospitals. And her drug discovery background and really validating what you and I have been talking about. And I feel like the world really understands this, but for some reason, people are not getting behind infection control the way that they need to with this looming issue around antibiotics. It's going to get worse. And I don't understand why we're not doing more on the front end to reduce even the need for antibiotics.
Or whether we have foundations, for example, that fund these types of projects and whether they're interested in getting involved in this. Everyone says infection control is a priority and so important. And yet, if we don't have the money from private industry investing into the antibiotics to counter antibiotic resistance, then we don't see, or we find it very competitive to get funding for companies to, independent of investors, kind of drive this whole hand washing and hand hygiene compliance movement forward. Well, we're not going to get there without this type of funding and financial resources.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you can definitely find Carmela on LinkedIn. And if you look at her content there, she's even done a TED Talk. So I think everybody would enjoy finding that. Go connect with her on LinkedIn. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Transmission Control by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast application. And we have bonus content for certain episodes, but you got to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Larry and myself, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Transmission Control.